Snow fell over Valheim the night the world ended, and Aveline did not feel the cold. She stood at the edge of the great courtyard, hidden among the lowborn who had come to watch their betters, and she waited for the moment she had been promised. Torches lined the ceremonial stones. Banners the color of deep water hung from every wall. The whole kingdom had gathered for the choosing. The knight and Alpha King named the woman who would stand beside him for the rest of his life. Aveline waited because he had sworn to her, beneath the rowan trees, that the woman would be her, not in front of them. Not yet. Her own mother had begged her to keep it quiet, to let the words come from the king himself, so that no one could call it a low-born girl's lie. Aveline had agreed. She had trusted. She pressed her cold hands together beneath her cloak, and she trusted. Corvin Greymore walked to the center of the courtyard, and even from the back of the crowd, she knew him at once. The silver eyes. The Greymore mark passed down through his line like moonlight caught in glass. She had looked into those eyes 100 nights in secret. She knew them better than she knew her own face. The old elder raised his voice. The pack fell silent. Aveline's heart climbed into her throat, because this was the moment. This was the beginning of everything they had promised each other. Then Corvin turned. He lifted his hand. And he took the hand of the woman standing at his right, Sabine. Her sister. Aveline did not understand at first. She thought it was a trick of the torchlight, a cruel game that would end in a single breath. She waited for him to let go, to find her face in the crowd, to laugh and end it. He did not. His fingers closed around Sabine's. The elder began to speak the binding words, and the pack broke into a roar of joy that struck Aveline like a wave. She reached for the bond. For a year she had carried it inside her, that silver thread running from her heart to his, warm and living and certain. Every single day of her life, she had felt him at the other end of it. She reached for it now, the way a drowning woman reaches for the surface. She found nothing. The thread was gone, not broken, not torn. Gone, as though it had never lived at all, as though the year in secret had been a story she had told herself in the dark. Aveline pressed a hand flat to her chest, and felt only her own heart hammering in an empty room. He had chosen her sister. The bond was silent, and he was smiling. Something inside her went very quiet. She did not scream. She did not shove through the crowd and fall at his feet and beg him to look at her. She had her pride, and after tonight, her pride would be nearly the only thing she had left. So she turned, and she walked, and the cheering swallowed the sound of her leaving as cleanly as the snow swallowed her steps. Behind her the kingdom sang. Ahead of her lay the black road out of Valheim, and the long, cold country beyond it. Aveline stopped once, at the top of the rise, where the torchlight could no longer reach her. She looked back at the place that had been her entire world. Then she pressed one hand against the small curve of her belly, the secret she had not yet spoken to a single living soul, and she made herself a promise colder than the snow. They had taken the bond, they had taken the man, they had taken the life she thought was hers. They would not take this. And Aveline walked north, into the dark, until the lights of Valheim were nothing at all. 6 winters passed, and still the snow came to Valheim, and still Corvin Greymore hated it. He stood at the high window of the war room, while his advisors argued over grain stores and border patrols, and he watched the white come down over the courtyard, where long ago the moon had made its choice and broken him in the making of it. That was how he had learned to think of it, not as a wound he had caused, but as a thing the goddess had done to them all. His own heart had never healed. He had stopped waiting for it to. They called him a good king. Fair, they said. Hard, but fair. What they did not say to his face, though he heard it in the silences, was that he was a cold one. A king who had refused a Luna for 6 long years. A king who had let the Greymore line thin down to a single unmarried man because he could not bring himself to bind his life to anyone at all. Sabine had waited. The whole court knew Sabine had waited patient and lovely and endlessly forgiving. and still he had never spoken the final words that would have made her his. He could not have told anyone why. Only that each time the elders pressed the ceremony upon him, something in his chest turned to ice, and a name he never allowed himself to finish rose into the back of his throat and died there unspoken. They had pressed him again only that morning. The high elder, gentle and relentless, Sabine at his side, with her hands folded and her eyes soft. A king needs a Luna, they had told him. A line needs an heir. And Corvin had said what he always said, which was not yet, and he had watched something tighten behind Sabine's patient smile before she smoothed it away. He had not understood that tightening. He had never understood it. He only knew that every year the pressure grew, and every year the ice in his chest answered it. And neither one of them would say the thing that lay beneath the horn sounded from the outer wall, one long note, then too short. Corvin was already moving before his mind had caught up with his feet. A captain met him on the stair, snow still melting on his shoulders, his face the particular gray of a man who did not know how to say the thing he had come to say. 2 children, he told the king, found at the outer gate, a little after dawn, half frozen in cloaks, not fit for a mild autumn, let alone this. No pack scent on them, that any tracker in the guard could read, which by itself should not be possible, for every wolf child carries the smell of its people. These carried nothing, no parents, no guardian, no story that held together when you pulled at it. And they will not speak, the captain said, not to the healers, not to the guards, not to me. They say one thing only. They say they will speak to the silver-eyed king, and to no one else under the moon. Corvin stopped on the stair. The silver-eyed king. Children did not ask for kings. Children, when they were cold and frightened and alone, asked for their mothers. He had learned that much in 6 years of ruling, that a kingdom was only a great many frightened people wanting their mothers. And yet, these two had walked through a killing snow, asking for him, by the one thing about him no herald ever announced. He found them in the small warming room off the kitchens, where the ovens kept the air thick and close. Someone had wrapped them in blankets far too large, so that they seemed to be drowning in wool, and they sat pressed so tightly together on the bench that they might have been one small creature with 2 dark heads, a girl and a boy. The girl held the boy's hand in both of hers. She held it the way, Corvin thought, without knowing why the thought should ache so, the way a person holds the one thing in all the world they cannot bear to lose. He crossed the room slowly and lowered himself to a crouch before them, the way he might approach a frightened pup, and he opened his mouth to offer some small, gentle word. And his wolf rose inside him, not with hunger, not with the old, restless weariness he carried into every strange room. It rose the way a hound rises when it hears, far off and long awaited, a footstep it has known since birth. It pressed toward the 2 children on the bench with a low, urgent certainty that had no words in it, only a single pull. Home, home, home. And Corvin had felt nothing like it in 6 years, and the last time he had felt it, it had been standing under the rowan trees, looking at a low-born healer with river light in her hair. He had no time to understand it, for in that moment the girl lifted her head and looked at him. Silver. Her eyes were silver, not gray, not pale, not the ordinary lightness that flattering poets called silver. They were the true thing. Moonlight, caught in glass. The mark that ran through the Greymoor line and through no other line in all the wolf kingdoms, back and back beyond the reach of any record. He had seen those eyes exactly twice in his life. In his father, dead, these 10 winters, and every morning of his life, in the polished steel of his own glass. Then the boy raised his head as well, the same eyes. The same impossible silver, looking out at him from a small, cold, guarded face that was trying very hard to be brave. Those were his eyes, in 2 faces he had never seen. The warming room had gone entirely silent. The captain by the door. 2 healers, who had been hovering with broth and warm cloths, a pair of kitchen servants frozen mid-step, all of them staring, and Corvin understood, with a slow, cold horror, that every soul in that room was doing the same terrible sum he was doing. It was not a secret thing. The Greymoor mark. Every wolf in Valheim knew it bred true only in the king's blood. Only ever in the king's blood. And every wolf in Valheim also knew that their cold king had taken no woman to his bed in 6 years, and that the one woman he was said to have loved before he ever wore the crown was 6 years dead in the cold green water of the Murin. Silver eyes, 2 children of perhaps 6 years, a king who had counted every one of those years, the way a man counts the beads of a mourning cord. The arithmetic was not difficult. It was only impossible. A healer, meaning kindness, stepped nearer with a cup of broth held out. The boy flinched back so hard he struck his head on the wall, and from his small throat came a sound Corvin knew in his marrow, a growl. Thin and weak and utterly a wolf's. The girl pulled her brother behind her shoulder in the same motion and fixed the healer with a glare far too old for her face, and the healer stepped back with her hand pressed to her heart. And Corvin felt it. For one breath, for less than a breath, he felt the children's fear as though it were his own, a bright cold spike of it, lancing through his chest. The animal terror of small things that have learned the world is full of hands that hurt. Then it was gone, but it left him shaking, because a wolf did not feel the fear of strangers. A wolf felt the fear of its own blood, along the threads that ran between kin, and no other way at all. The old healer nearest him twisted her apron in both hands. She did not ask her question aloud. She did not need to. It filled the little room from floor to rafter, the same question standing in every pair of eyes that had turned to him. "Whose children are these? Your Majesty, whose?" Corvin had no answer, and for the first time in 6 long years, he wanted one so badly that his hands, resting on his knees, had begun to shake. He gentled his voice with an effort that cost him more than any battle ever had. He asked the girl her name. She studied him a long moment, weighing him on some scale of her own, deciding whether a silver-eyed man crouching in a warm room was the man the warning had meant. Then in a small, clear voice she said, "I am Rilla, and this is Sorn." He does not talk to people. He does not know. Corvin nodded slowly, as though his whole life did not hang upon the next words out of a child's mouth. "And your mother," he said. "Can you tell me your mother's name?" Rilla's small chin came up. There was something fierce in the set of it, something he half knew and could not place, though it tugged at the buried thing in his chest until he thought it would tear loose. And then she said the name. The name no one in Valheim had dared speak in his hearing for 6 long years. The name he had forbidden in the early days, when the sound of it could still drop him to his knees. The name he had buried so deep beneath crown and duty and ice that even his own grief could no longer find its way down to it. Aveline. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Corvin's boots, and the whole cold world with it. For a moment, the king could not speak at all. Aveline. He had not heard it said, aloud, in 6 years, and to hear it now, from a child, in a warming room, off the kitchens, offered as lightly as if it cost her nothing at all, undid something in him he had spent all that time carefully bricking up. The whole guarded house he had raised over her grave shifted and groaned like river ice at the first breath of a thaw. "She is dead," he wanted to say. "Your mother drowned in the Murin the winter I lost her. They found her cloak on the black rocks below the falls, and they never found the rest. And I mourned her until morning nearly killed. Me too." But the words would not come, because the 2 children in front of him were perhaps 6 years old, and Aveline had walked down to that river 6 winters ago, and Corvin was a king who could count, and the sum of it was opening beneath him like a pit. He was still kneeling there, drowning in it, when the door opened at his back, and the past walked in wearing 2 familiar faces. Sabine came first, as she always came first, graceful and pale in her winter gray, her voice already shaping itself around some soft and practiced concern. "Corvin, my love, the servants are all in a state. They're saying the strangest things about—" She stopped. Her gaze had found the children on the bench, and whatever she had meant to say died in her open mouth. Corvin watched her, because he had spent 6 years learning to read the faces of people who wanted things from him, and what moved across Sabine's face in that instant was not what any innocent face should have shown. It was not surprise. A woman meeting two lost orphans for the first time might feel pity, or curiosity, or an easy, shallow nothing. She would not feel this. Sabine had gone the color of tallow. Her hand rose halfway to her throat and stopped there as though it had forgotten its purpose. And her eyes, when they fixed upon the small silver eyes of the girl, held no confusion in them at all. They held fear. Behind her swept Morwenna, his mother by law, or near enough to it, the woman who had steered her elder daughter toward his throne. With 6 years of patience and soft, relentless pressure, she entered the little room, the way she entered every room in the palace. Chin lifted, certain of her welcome, a queen in all but name. And then she saw the children, and for the space of a single heartbeat, Morwenna stopped as though she had struck a wall of glass. She recovered almost at once. Almost. She was far more practiced at this than her daughter would ever be. But Corvin had been watching for it now, hunting it, and he caught the flicker before she folded it away behind her composure. The same flicker he had seen in Sabine. Not shock, not the honest bewilderment of a stranger before a mystery. Something older, and colder, and heavier. The look of one who has dreaded a knock at the door for a very long time and has just heard it fall. But it was the children who told Corvin the most. For Rilla, who had glared down a healer and faced a strange king without a tear, went white when Morwenna crossed the threshold. She snatched Soren fully behind her, both arms spread, and the boy pressed his face into her shoulder and made himself as small as a child can make himself. They had not feared the guards. They had not feared the king with the terrible silver eyes. They feared this woman in the doorway, the way a rabbit fears a shadow. It has felt pass over it before. Corvin marked it. His wolf marked it, and began, low in his chest, to growl. "What is this?" Morwenna said. Her voice was steady, and that steadiness was itself a confession, for no one truly at ease asks a question in quite that tone. "Two children came to my gate before dawn," Corvin said. He rose slowly to his full height, and he did not fail to see how both women tracked the movement, wary as deer that have caught a scent on the wind. "They came to me through the worst of the winter, and they have my eyes." The silence that followed had a weight to it, like the air before lightning. It was the old healer who broke it. She had drawn one of the gate guards aside and questioned him, low and quick, and now she came forward with her troubled face, and her trouble had nothing to do with the strangeness of silver eyes. "Your Majesty," she said, "forgive me for speaking of it so plainly before the court, but these little ones did not simply lose their way and wander here. Their feet are cut through, and their small hands are frostbitten, and not from a lazy ramble. They were driven hard, and for days. And there is this." The boy had it sewn into the lining of his coat, hidden, where no hand but a searching one would find it. She opened her palm. Upon it lay a scrap of parchment, water-stained, its ink half run into ghosts. A single line, written in a hurried and frightened hand. "Find the silver-eyed king. Trust no one else." Corvin took it from her. He read it once. He read it 3 times more. These children had not lost their way to Weilheim. Someone had aimed them at it. Straight and desperate, the way a dying archer looses a last arrow. Someone had sat in the dark and sewn a warning into a small boy's coat and sent 2 children walking into the teeth of winter, toward the one man in all the world their silver eyes belonged to. And that someone had written 4 words more, 4 words that turned the whole cold morning over in his hands. Trust no one else, as though the road between here and wherever they had fled held people who must not be trusted. People who would want two silver-eyed children, never to arrive. He lowered the parchment. He looked at the two women standing frozen in his doorway. And across the small warm room, quick as a drawn blade and gone as fast, Sabine and Morwenna exchanged a single glance. Most people in that room would have missed it entirely. Corvin did not. His whole body went still and cold around the meaning of it. Because he had asked no question, yet he had accused no living soul of anything. And still, that glance had leapt between mother and daughter, swift and wordless and sure, the glance of two people confirming with each other that a story told long ago was still holding, still safe, still sealed. The children had not stumbled to his gate by accident. They had escaped to it. And someone beneath his own roof, someone who had sat at his own table through 6 years of winters, had known these silver eyes existed long before this morning had ever dawned, and had spent a great and secret effort making certain they never once reached him. Corvin rode north into the worst of the winter, and he did not let the children out of his sight. He could have sent his fastest riders and stayed warm behind his walls. A king was not meant to chase ghosts through blizzards. But the girl had said a name that the dead do not say, and the boy had carried a warning sewn into his coat, and Corvin had discovered that morning that there was not enough duty in all the world to keep him from the road. So he wrapped the twins in furs and set them before him on the saddle, and Rilla told him the way in her small, hard voice. North and north again, toward the border town of Thornhold, where the mountains ate the sky. They spoke little as they rode. Once, when the wind fell, Rilla said, without turning her head, "You are the silver-eyed king. Mama said, if we ever had no one left we should find you." Corvin asked her what else her mother had said. Rilla was quiet a long while. Then she said, "That you chose someone prettier than us." And Corvin, who had faced armies without flinching, found he could not answer a 6-year-old at all. It was the boy who spoke next, and that startled the king more than the girl had, for Soren had not said a single word to him in 3 days of riding. The child tipped his head back to look up at Corvin, those silver eyes so like his own, and said, very softly, "You have Mama's crying eyes." Corvin asked him what he meant. Soren only turned his face back into the fur and would not say another word, but Rilla answered for him. "He means you look sad the way Mama looks sad," she said, "when she thinks we are asleep, when she looks at the road." And Corvin rode the rest of that hour in silence, because a road was a thing a man could ride away down, and he began to wonder, for the first time, which of them had done the leaving. They reached Thornhold at dusk on the 3rd day. He had braced himself for many things. He had not braced himself for the door of the little stone house, hanging from one hinge, or the snow inside it drifted across an overturned table, or the dark stain frozen into the floorboards that no one had troubled to clean. Signs of men who had come in violence, days old and gone. His wolf surged up snarling. The children went rigid in his arms. "She is not here," Rilla whispered. "They came at night. Mama put us out the back window and told us to run and not stop and not trust anyone who was not you." Her voice did not shake. That was the worst of it, Corvin thought. A child of 6 should not be able to say such a thing without her voice shaking. He was still standing in the wreck of that little house when a neighbor woman crept to the broken door, wringing her hands, and told him the rest. The men had not found the children. In their fury they had taken the mother instead, bound and half frozen, meaning to carry her south. But the mountain road was cruel in winter, and a wheel had broken, and the healer woman had slipped her ropes in the dark and fled into the pines. She was alive. She was hiding in the high shepherd's hut above the town, wounded, half-starved, waiting for word of her children and afraid to come down. Corvin left the twins with his most trusted guard and climbed alone. He did not know what he would say. For 6 years, he had believed her drowned. He had wept for her, in the private hours no one saw, until the weeping had worn a hollow in him that never filled. And now he climbed a frozen mountain toward a hut, with smoke rising thin from its roof, and his heart beat so hard, he thought it might break his ribs, and he still did not know what a man says to a woman he has mourned as dead. He pushed open the door. She sat by a mean little fire, a blade in her hand, turning toward the sound with the flat readiness of someone who had learned to expect the worst. Thinner than he remembered, a fresh cut healing along her cheek. Her dark hair shot through now with a single streak of gray at the temple that had not been there when she was young, but it was her. It was Aveline, alive and breathing, and looking at him across 6 years and a small dying fire. For one heartbeat, her face broke open with something that was almost joy, the old helpless gladness of a bonded thing at the return of its other half, before her mind caught up with her heart and slammed the door on it. And then she looked at him with a hatred so pure it stopped him where he stood. "You," she said. Corvin could not speak. His throat had closed. Aveline, he managed at last, and the name came out cracked and strange, a word he had forbidden his own tongue for 6 long years. "Do not," she said, and rose, the blade still in her hand. "Do not say my name, as though it means something to you." She was shaking, not with fear he saw, but with a fury that had been feeding on itself in the dark for 6 winters. "You let them take my children's home apart. You sat on your throne in your warm hall while your men came in the night with ropes, and now you climb my mountain and you say my name. I thought you were dead," Corvin said. It was all he had. "I have grieved you every day. They found your cloak on the rocks below the falls. They told me you had drowned." Something flickered across her face, then hardened over. "How convenient," she said, "that the dead cannot argue." She took a step toward him, and her voice dropped low and terrible. "You chose her. In front of the whole pack you took my sister's hand, and you felt me reach for you, and you turned away. And you have the gall to stand there with your grief." She laughed, a broken, awful sound. "You do not even have the grace to look ashamed." "I felt the bond go out like a snuffed candle," she went on, quieter now, which was somehow far worse than the shouting. "1 year, you were mine. 1 year, I felt you at the other end of that thread every hour I breathed. And then I stood in that courtyard, and I reached for you, and there was nothing there. Nothing. You did not break it gently. You did not break it at all. You simply let it die." And took her hand and never once looked for my face in the crowd. "That is not possible," Corvin said. His own voice sounded far away to him. "A true bond does not simply die." "No," she said. "It does not." And her silver-shot eyes held his, waiting, as though she had laid a trap and did not yet know she had laid it. And Corvin, who could read guilt in any face in his kingdom, stood in the doorway of that cold hut and felt his own confusion answer her like a blow he had never seen coming, because there was no shame in him to show. Whatever had happened at the choosing, he did not remember choosing at all. Aveline came back to Valheim because her children were in Valheim, and for no other reason, under the moon. She made that very clear. She would take the king's guards and the king's high walls and the king's healers for the cut along her cheek, because these things stood between her son and daughter and the men who had come in the night. She would not take his apologies. She would not take his company. She would not sit at his table, nor answer the questions in his eyes. She moved into the guarded wing he gave her, and she shut the door. And Corvin stood on the wrong side of it like a beggar at a gate he himself had built. He could have commanded her. He was a king. Instead, he went back to his own chambers, and he sat in the dark, and at last, after 6 years of looking the other way, he made himself think carefully about the night he had lost her. It was harder than it should have been. That was the thing he had never let himself notice. When a man remembers the worst night of his life, he remembers it too well. Every cruel detail carves itself into him. But when Corvin reached for the choosing, he found not a wound, but a fog. He remembered the torches. He remembered the cold. He remembered lifting the ceremonial cup and drinking, as an alpha must, And after that the night went soft and gray at the edges, like a shape seen through deep water. He remembered taking Sabine's hand. He did not remember deciding to. He remembered the elder's voice speaking the binding words, and his own wolf howling somewhere far below, frantic, clawing, trying to reach something across the crowd that Corvin in his fog could not name. He had always blamed the grayness on grief, on the shock of a bond declaring itself, on the horror of losing Aveline in the same hour. Grief made a mess of memory. Everyone knew that. He had told himself so for 6 years and never once looked closer. Now he looked closer, and the fog gave up its pieces, one at a time. The way a nightmare returns in daylight. A hand at his elbow, steadying him, though he had not known he needed steadying. A voice near his ear, low and warm and reasonable, telling him he was overcome, telling him it was the moon's doing, telling him to breathe and let it happen. His knees, strange beneath him, the torches swimming into long smears of gold. And beneath it all, far down, that terrible howling he had spent 6 years mistaking for grief, his wolf hurling itself again and again at something it could not reach. He had never asked whose hand had steadied him. He had never asked whose voice had told him to breathe. He had been so certain the moon had chosen, and so broken by the choosing, that he had let those small kind hands lead him wherever they wished. And Corvin went very still in the dark, because he understood, at last, the shape of the thing that had been wrong all along. He had been ill, that night, not grieving. Sweating and swaying and half-blind, his own body a stranger to him, his wolf screaming from behind a wall he could not climb. He had been ill on the single most important night of his life, and in 6 long years, drowning in guilt and duty and sorrow, he had never once stopped to ask himself why. He was still sitting with that when the gray light came, and he rose, and he went to find her. She opened the door because the children were sleeping, and she did not want him knocking. She stood in the gap of it with her arms folded, and she looked at him the way one looks at bad weather. "Tell me about that night," Corvin said. "Not what I did, what you saw." "Why?" she said flatly. "Because I do not remember it," he said, and saying it aloud frightened him worse than any wound he had ever taken. "Because I have just understood that I do not remember it, and I have never let myself know that I do not remember it." "Tell me what you saw." Something in his voice must have reached her, because after a long moment she began to speak, low and bitter and precise, as though she had recited it to herself 1,000 times in the dark. She told him of the year before, the secret year, the rowan trees at the forest's edge, where a low-born healer and a young alpha had met in the dark and bound themselves to each other with no witness but the moon. She told him what he had carved for her with his own knife, a small token of rowan wood, and what he had sworn to her when he pressed it into her hand, that whatever the pack demanded of him, whatever crown they set upon his head, he would name her before all of them, that he would sooner lose the throne than lose her. She told him other things, too, small things, the things that cannot be invented, how he had come to her hut with a fever the first winter, and let a low-born healer put her hands on an alpha's skin when any other lord would have died first. How he had learned the names of every herb on her shelf, and gotten every one of them wrong on purpose to make her laugh. How they had lain beneath the rowan on the night the bond took hold and felt the thread pull tight between them, and how he had wept, this hard young alpha, wept with the joy of it, and sworn that no crown would ever be worth more to him than that thread. Every word of it landed on Corvin like a stone, because he remembered none of it, and yet all of it rang true in him the way a struck bell knows its own note. "You swore that to me," she said, and her voice finally cracked. "With my hands in yours. And then I stood in that courtyard, and I watched you swear something else to my sister instead." The taste came into Corvin's mouth. It came from nowhere, sudden and total, a taste he had not tasted in 6 years, and had never once thought of since. Bitter, cold, like copper and crushed root and something green beneath it, something that coated the tongue and would not wash away. The taste of the ceremonial cup. He had drunk, and it had been bitter under the honeyed wine, and he had thought nothing of it, because who questions the cup a king is handed on the night of his choosing? Corvin staggered. He put out a hand and caught the doorframe. The fog in his memory tore, just once, just for an instant, and through the tear he saw it, the cup at his lips, the bitter root. His own hand rising, not by his will but by another's, a soft hand at his wrist, guiding his fingers towards Sabine's, while his wolf threw itself howling against the inside of his skull, reaching, across the crowd toward a face it could not make his drugged eyes find. Aveline. His wolf had been screaming her name the whole time. More of it tore loose now, faster than he could hold. The weight of his own head, too heavy for his neck. The way the crowd had blurred into a single roaring animal. Sabine's face, swimming up close, wrong, all wrong. His wolf, recoiling from her even as his drugged hand closed around hers. The elder's mouth moving. The binding words falling on him like snow, cold and smothering and impossible to brush away. And somewhere out past the torches, a figure at the edge of the crowd turning to go. A slim, dark shape walking away into the night, and his whole soul lunging after her, while his body stood rooted and smiling and betrayed him with its stillness. He had watched her leave, some drowned part of him had watched Aveline turn and walk away, and had been unable to move so much as a hand to stop her, and someone had put a taste in his cup to make certain of it. Corvin, Aveline said, and the anger in her voice had given way to something uncertain, almost afraid, because a king does not clutch a doorframe and shake. "What is wrong with you?" "I was drugged," he whispered. The words came out of him raw. That night, the cup. There was something in the cup. And he looked up at her with 6 years of fog tearing open behind his eyes. And he saw her want, so badly, not to believe him. Aveline did not believe him. She wanted to, and that wanting was its own kind of agony to her. And so she armored herself against it, with all the fury 6 years had taught her. "A cup," she said. "You would have me forgive everything for a cup." She shook her head slowly. "Men like you are never at fault. There is always a cup, or a counselor, or a cruel turn of the moon. Never you." She stepped back from the door. "Get out. Let me tend my children in peace." And Corvin, because he did not know what else to do, went. He walked the cold corridors of his own palace, like a man walking under water, the taste of bitter root still ghosting on his tongue, the torn fog still bleeding memory behind his eyes. He had no proof. He had only a taste and a howling and the certainty, new and terrible, that the great wound of his life had been dealt to him on purpose, and not merely suffered. He needed to see them, the children. He did not fully understand the need, only that his wolf was dragging him toward it, and he had learned in the last 3 days to stop arguing with his wolf. He found them in the nursery he had ordered prepared, Rilla building a fortress of cushions, with grim concentration, Soren curled in the window seat, watching the snow. Corvin sat down on the floor a careful distance away the way he had learned to, and for a while he simply watched his son watch the weather. Then Soren turned his head, and the light caught something at his throat, a cord. An ordinary bit of leather cord, the kind a mother knots for a child, and hanging from it, worn smooth and dark with handling, a small disc of pale wood. Corvin's breath stopped. He knew that wood. Rowan. He knew that shape. A clumsy, uneven circle a young man had cut too fast, because his hands were shaking with feeling. And when Soren, uneasy under the king's stare, closed his small fist around it, Corvin saw for one instant the thing carved into its face, a running wolf. Crude, lopsided, one leg longer than the others, the work of a knife, guided more by love than by skill. He had made that. On a summer night beneath the rowan trees, with his own blade and his own trembling hands, he had cut a lopsided wolf into a scrap of pale wood, and pressed it into the palm of a low-born healer, and sworn upon it that he would name her before the world. "May I see it?" Corvin whispered. Soren looked to his sister. Rilla studied the king a long moment, then gave a small nod, and only then did the boy lift the cord over his head and hold it out on his open palm, the way Corvin had once held it out to Aveline. Corvin took it, and the moment the rowan touched his skin, the last wall in him came down. It did not come as fog now. It came whole and merciless and complete. The summer of the secret year, every stolen hour of it. The fever and the herbs and the wrong names that made her laugh. The night the bond took hold, and he had wept for joy. The vow, the wolf, the token warm from his own hands. And then the choosing, seen clearly at last through the torn grey veil, the bitter cup, and the guiding hand and his own body, made a traitor to his soul. And then, worst of all, the part he had never known, and now could not unknow. They had not simply let him believe the moon had chosen. They had needed. Aveline gone, truly gone, past all his searching. So while he lay senseless in the days after, sick unto death with a poison no healer could name, they had taken a cloak of hers and laid it torn upon the black rocks below the falls, and they had come to his bedside with grave faces and told him the low-born girl had been lost to the river in her grief. And he had believed them. Goddess forgive him, wrecked and drugged and grieving, he had believed them, and he had buried her name, and he had never gone down to the river to look for a body that was not there, because they had told him there was nothing left to find. He saw now how neatly it had all been done, how a grieving king asks few questions, how a torn cloak on black rock will answer every one he does think to ask. They had not even needed to be cruel about it, in the end. They had only needed him broken enough to be gentle with, and drugged enough to be steered, and sad enough to want the searching to stop, and he had obliged them in every particular. He had made himself the easiest man in the world to deceive, and he had called it morning. She had not drowned. She had walked north, carrying his children under her heart, believing every step of the way that the man beneath the rowan had looked her in the eye and chosen her sister. For 6 years he had mourned a woman who was alive. For 6 years she had hated a man who had never betrayed her, and both of those things had been built, stone by patient stone, by the same 2 pairs of hands. Beneath the grief, something else was waking, slow and cold and patient. The thing his enemies should have feared most of all. For 6 years his wolf had thrown itself against a wall built of lies, and now the wall was down, and on the other side of it stood every person who had built it. He knew their faces. He had eaten bread with them. He had all but called one of them Mother. Corvin knelt on the nursery floor with the little wolf clenched in his fist and his silver eyes streaming, and his son watched him with a child's solemn wonder, and Rilla came and stood very close and said, in her small, hard voice, "Why is the king crying?" "Because," Corvin said, when he could speak at all, "I have been lied to for a very long time. And so, little one, have you." Corvin did not go to Morwenna in a rage. He went to her with paper. He had ruled long enough to know that fury is the easiest thing in the world. To dismiss a shouting king is only a king having a bad night. A quiet king with a ledger open before him is something else entirely. So Corvin spent 3 days being very quiet, and in those 3 days he learned how a lie is kept. He began with the men who had ridden north. It was not hard, once he cared to look. Soldiers must be paid, and payment leaves a mark. And the coin that had sent armed riders to a healer's door in Thornhold had not come from any account of the crown. It had come from Morwenna's own household purse, disbursed by her own steward, entered in a careful hand under a heading that said only, "The Northern Matter." The Northern Matter? As though a living woman and 2 children were a leaking roof to be seen to. He found the rest by pulling that single thread. Payments to watchers in the border country, quiet sums paid twice a year, going back not 6 months, but 6 years. They had known. That was the thing that turned Corvin's blood to river ice as he sat alone with the ledgers. They had not discovered Aveline by accident this winter. They had known where she was, almost from the beginning. They had let her live in her poverty and her silence, because a silent, low-born healer in the far north was no threat to anyone. And then 2 children with silver eyes had grown old enough to talk, and a king had gone on refusing to take his Luna year after stubborn year, and suddenly the northern matter had needed to be closed. He found the old healer last, the one who had tended him in the gray days after the choosing, pensioned off handsomely, living fat and frightened in a house too fine for a physician of his rank. It took very little. A king at your door on a winter morning, silver eyes, gone flat and cold, has a way of loosening a guilty tongue. The man wept before Corvin had asked him a single question. He confessed to the second draft, the one they had poured down a senseless king's throat for days to keep the drug's grip fast. He confessed to the torn cloak laid on the rocks. He confessed that a low-born girl had sent a letter once, in the first spring, begging the king to know that she lived and carried his child, and that the letter had been burned in a brazier in Morwenna's own rooms, while the girl who carried it was turned out of the palace gates. A letter Aveline had written to him. She had reached across the whole cold distance of that first terrible year, and someone had burned her words and let her believe he had read them and turned away. Corvin folded that knowledge up small and put it somewhere deep, where it could go on burning without blinding him, and then he sent for Morwenna. She came expecting a wedding, or something near it. He had let her think so. She swept into his study in her finest, certain that the king's long, strange grief had finally run its course, and that her patience of 6 years was about to be crowned. Then she saw the ledgers open on his desk, and the old healer's sealed confession beside them, and the small carved token of rowan wood set atop the pile like a judge's gavel, and Morwenna stopped in the center of the room. "Sit," Corvin said. She did not sit. She lifted her chin, the same gesture he had seen in a small, fierce girl on a horse 3 days before, and Corvin understood, only now, where Rilla had come by it, and hated that even this monster had given his daughter something. "You have been busy," Morwenna said. "Tell me why," Corvin said. She did not pretend for long. That was almost the worst of it. A lesser villain might have wept and denied and clung to the story until it was torn from her. Morwenna simply looked at the evidence and looked at him and decided that the game was played out and told him the truth as though explaining a sum to a slow child. "Because a low-born healer cannot be a Luna," she said. "Because my daughter Sabine was born to stand beside a king, and your little herb witch was born to grind poultices in a hut, because I have 2 daughters, and I would not watch the lesser one steal the crown that belonged to the greater. It was never hatred, Majesty. Do not flatter the girl. It was arithmetic." And her voice did not shake, and her eyes did not fall. And that steadiness was the most monstrous thing Corvin had ever seen. "You drugged me," he said. "You told me the woman I loved had drowned. You let her bear my children in the snow, and then you sent men to kill them." "I gave you 6 years to forget her," Morwenna answered, and there was something almost like reproach in it, as though he were the one who had failed. 6 years, and a good and gracious woman waiting at your side, and a kingdom laid out smooth before you. Any other man would have taken the gift. You were the one who could not let the dead stay buried. If there is blood on the snow now, Majesty, it is because you would not stop grieving. A girl I told you to forget." Corvin looked at her for a long moment. He had expected to find a monster wearing a human face. Instead, he found something worse, a woman who believed, to the very bottom of herself, that she had done nothing but tidy an untidy world. Her silence, when he did not answer, had the shape of yes. And Corvin understood, sitting there, the true cruelty of it. Not the poison, not even the lie. The cruelty was that all of it had worn the face of family. Aveline's own mother had told her to keep the bond secret, so that she would have no claim when the track closed. The woman Corvin was to have called Mother had smiled at him across 6 years of feast days, with a burned letter in her memory. The people who guard you, he thought, are the only ones who can truly cage you, because you never think to check the door they are standing in front of. The study door opened. Sabine came in, summoned by a servant who did not yet understand what he was walking into, and she took one look at her mother's face and the ledgers and the little rowan wolf, and every drop of color left her. "It was your hand," Corvin said to her, very softly, "at the choosing, on my wrist, guiding my fingers to yours. I have felt that hand in my nightmares for 6 years and never known whose it was." Sabine opened her mouth. No sound came out. "Do not trouble yourself," Corvin said, and got slowly to his feet and let the cold thing that had been waking in him since the nursery finally open its eyes. "You will both have your chance to speak." He gathered the rowan token gently off the pile, the one honest thing in that whole poisoned room, and closed his fist around it. "You will have it in front of the entire pack." He called the whole pack to the courtyard, and he let them believe it was a wedding. That was the last deception Corvin ever allowed in Weilheim, and he told himself it was mercy, though it was not. He wanted them all there. The nobles and the warriors, the pack elders, the servants who had bowed their heads for 6 years and said nothing. He wanted the truth spoken, where every soul who had helped bury it would have to stand and hear it dug back up. And he knew that if he summoned them to a reckoning, some would find reasons to be elsewhere. So he summoned them to a joining instead, and they came in their thousands, glad and garlanded, to the same snow-lit courtyard where the whole thing had begun. Morwenna and Sabine were made to stand upon the ceremonial stones. Guards ringed them close, though the crowd took the guards for honor and not for what they were. Sabine wore silver, as she had worn silver 6 years before. She had convinced herself, Corvin saw, that this was still somehow salvageable, that a king who had waited 6 years to shame her would surely not shame her before the world. She smiled her patient smile. It was the last time she ever wore it. Corvin climbed the platform, the elders beamed, the musicians lifted their pipes, and when he raised one hand for silence, the courtyard fell so quiet that he could hear the torches breathe. "6 winters ago," he said, and his voice carried across the packed square without effort, "I stood upon these stones and took a hand in mine, and I have spent every day since, wondering why my own heart called me a liar." He let that settle. 10,000 faces stared up at him. "Tonight, I know why. Because I was poisoned on this very ground. Because the cup they gave me was fouled with veil root, so that my wolf could not find its true mate in this crowd, and a soft hand could guide my drugged fingers to the wrong woman while the right one watched." The silence cracked. A murmur ran through the pack like wind through wheat. "There was a woman I loved before ever I wore this crown," Corvin went on, and he did not hide the break in his voice, for he was done hiding everything. "A healer of no great house. I was bonded to her, true bonded, beneath the rowan at the forest's edge. And on the night I was meant to name her before you all, I was drugged, and she was cast out, and within the year I was told she had drowned in the river, heartbroken and alone. I mourned her for 6 years. She had not drowned. She had fled north with my children beneath her heart, and she has raised them alone in the cold, while the ones who did this to us sat at my table and called themselves my family." He turned then and he beckoned, and 2 small figures were brought to the foot of the platform, well guarded, half hidden in furs. Rilla lifted her chin at the enormous crowd and did not flinch. Soren pressed close to his sister, and Corvin gently tilted their faces up into the torchlight so that the whole pack could see what he had seen in the warming room: silver eyes. 2 pairs of them. The Greymoor mark that breeds true in no blood but the king's. The courtyard erupted. The sound of 10,000 wolves, doing at once the arithmetic Corvin had done alone, was a thing he would never forget. Above it all, Sabine had gone grey as ash, and Morwenna stood rigid and unrepentant, and Corvin turned back to them and let the pack fall silent again, by will alone. "Sabine," he said, and his voice was terribly quiet now. "Before the moon and the whole of this pack, I unspeak the words that were spoken over us on this ground. You were never my choice. You knew it, and you took me anyway, drugged and blind. I strip from you every honor this throne ever lent you. You hold no name in Valheim now. You will be gone from my land by the rising of the moon, and you will not return while I draw breath." Sabine fell to her knees on the ceremonial stones. She did not beg. There was nothing left in her to beg with. "And to you," Corvin said, turning to Morwenna, who alone had not bowed, who alone met his eyes as though she still believed herself in the right. "You, I could kill, and no elder here would raise a word against it. But I have learned what your kind of justice does to a family, and I will not teach it to my children. You are cast out, stripped, unhoused, unnamed. Go and be nothing, in some place where no one has ever heard the name Grey Moor, and live a long time thinking on all you traded for a crown you will never touch." He had thought he would feel triumph. He felt only tired and clean, the way a wound feels clean after the poison is drawn. Then his gaze lifted past the kneeling women, past the roaring pack, to the very back of the courtyard, to the shadow beneath the far arch, where the torchlight could not reach. Aveline stood there. He did not know how long she had been listening. Long enough. She stood in the same darkness, at the edge of the same courtyard, where, 6 years before, she had watched him take her sister's hand and felt her whole world go silent. She had come tonight expecting, perhaps, to watch him betray her all over again. Instead, she had heard a king name her before 10,000 souls. Across all that torchlit distance, her eyes met his, and this time, Corvin did not look away. He came to her that night, not as a king, but as a man with nothing left to hide behind. He left the crown in his chambers. He knocked on the door of the guarded wing, the way any man knocks who is afraid of the answer. And when Aveline opened it, he did not draw himself up to his full height, and he did not command, and he did not explain. He simply looked at her, and then Corvin Greymoor, who had never knelt to anyone in his life, went down onto both knees on the cold stone floor. "Please," he said. Aveline stared down at him. She looked surprised, almost frightened, because kings do not kneel, and hard men do not kneel, and the Corvin she had built in 6 years of hating him could never have knelt, yet here he was. "I know it changes nothing," he said, the words coming rough and fast now that they had started. "I know a poisoned cup does not give you back 6 winters. It does not put me at your bedside when the children came. It does not unmake a single one of the nights. You waited and I never came. I was not there. Whatever the reason, I was not there. And you carried everything, alone." He drew a breath that shook. "I am not asking you to forgive it. I am only asking you to believe that I never once, in my whole life, chose to leave you." For a long moment Aveline said nothing. When she spoke at last, her voice was very quiet, and it was worse than any shouting. "Do you know what I had to do?" she said. "To survive you, I had to teach myself that you had never loved me at all. Every night for a year, I reached for that bond out of habit, and every night it was not there, and every morning I had to decide all over again that you were a man who had used a low-born girl and thrown her away. It was the only story that let me sleep." She wiped her face roughly. "I taught it to my own children. I told my son and my daughter that their father chose a prettier woman. I made you into a villain, because a villain I could live without. And now you kneel on my floor and tell me the villain never existed, and I do not know what to do with 6 years of hating a ghost." Corvin had no answer. There was none. He bowed his head. And it was then, staring at the floor, that he said the word again, softly, more to himself than to her. "Veil root. In the cup. I would know that taste anywhere, now bitter, like copper and green root. Whoever knew where to find Veilroot knew exactly what they were doing. Aveline went very still. Corvin did not notice at first. When he looked up, she had gone the color of old snow, and her hand had risen to her mouth. "What?" he said. She crossed the room as though in a dream, and she knelt by the traveling satchel that never left her side, a healer's satchel, worn soft with 6 years of hard roads. She dug beneath the bundled herbs and the clean linen, all the way to the bottom, where a person keeps the things they cannot look at and cannot throw away. And she drew out a small stoppered vial of dark glass, the ghost of a label still clinging to it. In a hand Aveline knew better than her own. Her mother's hand. "I took it the night I ran," she whispered, "from her stores. I was with child and I did not know what the road would hold, so I filled my satchel with whatever remedies I could carry, and this was among them, and I never knew what it was. The word written on it meant nothing to me. It frightened me. I told myself I kept it in case I ever learned." She looked up at him, stricken. "I have carried it for 6 years. Through everything. I never once opened it." Corvin took the little vial from her shaking hand, and the smell rose up between them, faint and old and unmistakable, bitter, like copper and green root. Neither of them spoke, because they both understood, in the same breaking instant, what it meant. The one thing in all the world that could have proven his innocence, the proof that could have ended 6 years of grief and hatred in a single afternoon, had been riding in Aveline's own satchel the entire time. She had carried it north through the snow. She had carried it into the little stone house. She had slept beside it every night. She taught herself to hate him. The truth had been in her own hands from the very first day, and neither of them had ever known. Forgiveness did not come all at once. It came the way the thaw comes to the north, so slowly that you cannot name the day the ice broke. Only that one morning you wake and hear water moving where there was silence before. Corvin did not push. He had learned that much. He did not ask her to love him again, or to trust him, or to pretend the 6 years had not happened. He only stayed. He learned the way Soren went quiet when he was overwhelmed, and the way Rilla asked her hardest questions sideways, never looking at you. He learned that Aveline still watched the road out of old habit, and that it took many weeks before she stopped, and that the morning she did stop was a victory he did not dare to mention aloud. When the first green came back to the world, Aveline took the children to the rowan trees at the forest's edge, and she let Corvin come with them. She did not say why. She did not have to. It was where the bond had been born, one summer a lifetime ago, and some part of her needed to stand in that place with the whole broken truth of it laid bare at last. The rowans were coming into leaf. The children ran ahead into the long grass, shrieking, "Wolf quick!" And for a while, Corvin and Aveline stood a careful arm's length apart and watched them, and said nothing, because there was too much to say and no order to say it in. Then Soren stopped his running. He came back to them, grave and small, the rowan token, which his father had given back into his small keeping, swinging on its cord at his throat. He looked up at his mother, and he looked up at his father, and with the terrible simple certainty of a child, he lifted the cord over his head. He took Aveline's hand and opened it. He set the little carved wolf in her palm. And then he took Corvin's hand and folded it closed over hers. The token pressed warm between them, and he held both their hands together in his 2 small ones, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "There," Soren said. "That is where it goes," and in the space where their hands met with the poison long since burned out of his blood, and the woman who had brewed it cast out beyond the mountains, something stirred. Aveline gasped. The thread. The silver thread that had run from her heart to his for 1 whole year, the thread she had felt die in a torchlit courtyard, and had spent 6 years teaching herself she had imagined, moved, faint, so faint. A single warm pulse, there and gone, like the first beat of a heart thought stopped. Veilroot suppresses a true bond. Any healer knows that much. It smothers the thread, it does not cut it. And a thread that was only smothered, given time and truth, and 2 hands willing to hold on, can wake. She looked up at Corvin, with tears standing in her eyes, and she felt him feel it too, felt his own shock and wonder come singing back down the thread to her, and for the first time in 6 long years, she was not alone at the other end of it. She did not fall into his arms. It was not that kind of ending, and she was not that kind of woman, and 6 years do not dissolve in a single spring afternoon. She simply did not let go of his hand. "It is not fixed," she said quietly. Her voice was steady. "I am not fixed. There is a great deal you were not here for, and some of it I do not know how to give back." "I know," Corvin said. "I am only saying," she went on, and her fingers tightened just slightly around the little wooden wolf and the warm hand that held it. "I am only saying that I will stop teaching my children to hate you, and I will stand here. And we will see." For a man who had lost everything twice over, it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. Corvin Greymore stood beneath the rowan trees with his hand in the hand of the woman he had mourned, his children turning cartwheels in the new grass, a thread he thought long dead beating faint and stubborn and alive between 2 hearts, and he understood at last that some things are not destroyed by the people who try to bury them. Some things only wait. Some things, given long enough, find their way back. Thank you for walking this long, cold road with me tonight. I hope Corvin and Adeline and their 2 silver-eyed little ones found a place in your heart the way they found one in mine. If this story moved you even a little, you know what would mean the world to me. Leave a like so the moon goddess knows you passed this way, and subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new tale of wolves and hearts and hard-won homecomings. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in this wide world are you listening from tonight? Your town, your country, your own quiet corner of the dark. I read every single one, and it never stops amazing me how far our little pack now reaches. Until the next story, hold your loved ones close. Trust the thread that ties you to the ones who are truly yours, and may your own long road always, always lead you home.